Okay, hi everybody. Obviously, I'm not going to be in today, and I thought this might be the next best thing to me not being here. So, what we're going to be doing is a couple of things. We're going to be introducing the lecture that we're going to finish on Wednesday. So, we'll go through a couple of slides of that. And then after that point, what we'll do is we're going to switch gears to looking at some more of the DBQ. So that's the plan for today. So I couldn't be there again. Another meeting at the district office. They seem to schedule these always on B days. So here we go. So if you could please just make sure that you have your Cornell notes out. We're going to be, as I said, we're going to be starting the lecture. But before we do, I wanted to really begin with a symbol of American imperialism, because that's really what Chapter 21 is about. And please don't forget that Chapter 21 notes are due for you guys on Friday. And the Panama Canal, I know that we're all to some extent familiar with. This is, of course, the man-made canal that the United States built, completed in 1914, that basically cut in half the trip from Atlantic to Pacific. And really, as I said, is a symbol of American imperialism. So, what I'd like you to do, and I'm not sure how this is going to work on the screencast, but we'll give it a go. Is I'd like you just to watch this little short on the Panama Canal. It's got some pretty interesting facts, but it'll be an intro, I should say, to our lecture today. So here we go. Okay, so that's just an overview of the Panama Canal. This is going to be the title of your lecture. It's going to be on American imperialism. And a couple things about the Panama Canal. Panama did not exist as a country until the U.S. made it exist. What is known as Panama now, it was actually part of Colombia at the beginning of the 20th century. And the United States actually backed a revolution that created the country of Panama, um, of course, in exchange for the power to build the Panama Canal. So it really has, as I said, become a symbol of American imperialism. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And I don't know if you guys noticed this from the video, but there was a photograph at the very onset of the video that was taken of a an individual dressed in white that was sitting on a crane, and that was Theodore Roosevelt, who was then president of the United States. He took over in 1901 after William McKinley was assassinated in in Buffalo, New York. And that photo is very significant because it was the first time in American history that a sitting president, in other words, this individual was president, had actually left the country. And so that's something to consider because we're talking about basically from Washington's presidency all the way until 1901, where a sitting American president had never left the United States. And in a way, it's very symbolic of the jump that the United States is going to make in the 20th century, kind of into the global competition with other countries. For the most part, during the 19th century, although we were industrializing like crazy, we were expanding within ourselves. And some decisions are going to be made here very soon, as you'll read in chapter 21, about the United States becoming an imperial country. And that's what we're going to be examining today. So what I'd like you guys to do is please get this slide down, and I'll give you a few seconds, and then I'll start talking about it. So I'm going to start kind of giving some of the reasons why the United States became an imperial country, and if need be, at the end of this explanation, if anyone needs to continue taking these notes, um, if our substitute teacher could pause the video at that point, I'll pause for a second when I'm done, kind of explaining this portion, and then that'll give people time to catch up. So one of the big reasons why the United States is considering becoming an empire is because of the money that we have invested in foreign countries, and it's something that basically the United States is considering because if you invest money in a foreign country and then some type of rebellion occurs, or if there is some type of civil unrest or economic unrest, it as a result, affects the investment the United States has made in that country. Essentially, bad for business. So, how do you basically guarantee that that particular country is going to be stable? Well, you make it part of your empire, whether it's something as direct as a colony to where you are basically saying to that country, hey, we're the ones in charge, deal with it. Or whether it's something rather subtle, like a sphere of influence, where the country seems independent, but it's actually being controlled behind the scenes by the imperial country. So we have a very large amount of money invested in foreign countries at the end of the 19th century, and we are trading with more foreign countries around the world. And because the United States is an industrial power, the only way that we continue our growth is by expanding our markets to sell goods. If you were to assume that there were 100 million Americans in the United States in, say, 1898, That is the limit of your market if you're planning on selling your goods only to the United States. So the way that you expand your economy and therefore expand, profits in the U.S. is that you look for markets outside of the U.S. to sell U.S. goods to, which of course is a benefit because of the fact that it will guarantee U.S. jobs. It will increase productivity, which then is a boost to the economy. So economics is really tied to the decision why the United States became imperial. And I think it's something that we need to consider because, we were a republic and we still are a republic, but we were a republic that had broken away in 1776 from an empire. So this notion that we are going to become an empire in a way is kind of betraying our former self. And it's a decision that's not taken lightly, but it's a decision that is made because the U.S. has to kind of look around and see what the reality of the situation is. And the reality is that the major trade partners and competitors that the U.S. has in the global market, all of them have empires. So we can make the very righteous decision to say, no, we're going to remain a republic. We're not going to be an empire, even though we did practice imperialism within our own borders against Native Americans. Or we are going to continue to grow the United States in terms of economy and influence by adding our own imperial holdings. Now, when you make the decision to get an empire, you need to increase your military strength. We see this as one of the major causes of World War I that you guys may remember in your world history classes, where nations like Britain and Germany, for example, engaged in an arms race to basically give a deterrent to their competitors to say, hey, don't mess with my empire because I have this big navy or this big army. Now, the United States, by jumping into imperialism, has to make that same determination. And what makes the United States very unique is that our military expansion is going to be specific to our borders. So if you think about it, our northern border obviously is shared with Canada, which is a holding of Great Britain at the time, and our southern border with Mexico. But our western and eastern borders are basically the oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic. And that said, our major trade partners are thousands of miles away in either direction. So if we're going to create an empire, we're going to have, at the very least, a very, very large navy, which we're going to talk about momentarily. Some of the other motivations for the United States becoming an empire, racism is part of it. And just to clarify, it's not like, the U.S. government says, oh, let's go somewhere and be racist. It was more of the prevailing notion at the end of the 19th century that it was the, quote, white man's burden to civilize the rest of the world. This is certainly something that the British deployed when they expanded their empire in the 18th and 19th century. But the United States, remember, we also did this as well in the 19th century when we were asking Native Americans to assimilate to American culture. And lastly, I mean, if you think about it, we had been expanding ever since our inception in 1776. Obviously, our first border was the Appalachian Mountains, then the Mississippi River after the Louisiana Purchase, and so on into the west. And once we hit Wounded Knee, which is the marker for the end of westward expansion, we really didn't have anywhere else to expand. So it was at that point that then we looked to continue our expansion outside of our own borders. And that's kind of where we're going to be moving to next. So if anyone needs a little more time to get this down on their Cornell notes, I'm going to pause here for about 10 seconds to give our substitute teacher enough time to pause the video. And then when everyone's ready, we will start again. So see you in 10 seconds. Okay, so we mentioned the United States expanding its naval powers. And really, if you look at our country in this map that's portrayed on the screen right now, you will see that our empire that we do create is an empire of islands. And that makes sense because of the nature of our geographic location. Most of the islands that are U.S. territorial holdings, as you see, are located in the Pacific Ocean, We do have some in the Atlantic, which we'll be talking about later in a few moments. Um, but the U.S. Needs to have a big Navy. And you want to make sure you get this bottom section down here at the bottom of the slide down in your Cornell notes, because it is imperative that you guys understand that when Theodore Roosevelt became president, and we'll be talking more about him on Wednesday, he read a book that was written by a former naval captain named Alfred T. Mahan. And the book was entitled The Influence of Sea Power. And in this book, Mahan called for the rapid and modernization and expansion of the United States Navy in order to expand U.S. influence. So, if this is America's empire in 1901, we need to assume that the only way the United States is going to be able to protect that is with a very large Navy. And we built a very large Navy under Roosevelt's kind of supervision primarily, and then to a certain extent under his successor after 2 terms, William Howard Taft. The United States builds very rapidly a very modern and a very offensive navy. And what I mean by that, by offensive, is that our Navy at this point was big, but it was meant for defensive purposes only. The Navy that we build, that becomes the Great White Fleet, is something that is a way of projecting American strength around the globe. And when the Great White Fleet was completed, these ships were massive, and we became literally in less than 7 years the third largest navy in the world. And that kind of gives you an idea of the industrial output and the capability of the United States at the time. And these ships were nicknamed or coined the Great White Fleet because they were painted white, and they had these kind of gold decorations all over the place on them, and they shined when the sun hit them. A very kind of intimidating sight to see. And what the United States did is, after we built the bulk of the battleships that made up the Great White Fleet, we took it on tour. And it was kind of put out there as a goodwill tour, like we were going to go around and spread American culture. They went all over the globe, stopped at every major continent, and when they would stop in these ports, they would hold festivals and dances, and they would spread American culture, and they would invite people on the ships and serve hot dogs and apple pie, and they would hold baseball games at local fields to kind of teach the local inhabitants about one of the major pieces of American culture. They had bands that would travel with them that would play the ragtime music that was very popular at the time. But really, this tour was not meant to be just goodwill. It was meant to show the rest of the world that, hey, we just built this big bad navy and don't mess with us. And this is a direct result because of Mahan's book. Now, when you have a large navy and you have an empire of islands, what you have are a couple of things. Number one, you can extend your influence. And number two, you have plenty of places where your fleet can refuel. These are coaling stations where these ships can be based. We obviously know the most I guess famous of American naval bases in the Pacific, which is currently still in active duty, which is Pearl Harbor. And in addition to the fueling stations and extending of American influence, it becomes a buffer zone where basically now we have this massive fleet that buffers us both on the Atlantic and the Pacific side against any possible threat of invasion. And it also gives you an idea is that after we modernized our big navy, one of the big things that it called for was a quick way to get between the two oceans, hence the building of the Panama Canal. So the United States becomes an imperial country because of economic reasons primarily. And as a result of becoming imperial, as you see here on the map, we have to build a very large and modern navy, of which we still have today. And what we're going to be discussing next are basically some of the major holdings, which are listed on this map, that make up the modern American empire in 1901. So I will pause for 10 seconds yet again, and I'll give anyone a chance to kind of catch up to this, and then we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the last slide that we're going to be copying down on your Cornell notes today. And I just want to make sure that you guys understand. Please bring your Cornell notes back to class once you get the slide down, of course, on Wednesday, because we're going to be finishing our discussion on American imperialism. And one thing I didn't mention at the very beginning of the introduction is that all of the uh, topics that are covered both in the lecture today and then when I see you guys again on Wednesday are going to be used for your in-class DBQ, which you're going to write on Friday. So please keep that in mind in terms of you know, making sure you bring your stuff to school. So this is America's empire, and it's kind of hard to believe, but we actually made the decision to become an imperial country within 2 years of the end of the Civil War. As you can see on the map in the upper portion, we bought Alaska from the Empire of Russia for $7 million. And at the time, people made fun of the broker of that deal, Secretary of State William Seward, and said, hey, listen, you paid $7 million for an ice cube. But since then, we have obviously learned that the purchase of Alaska has been nothing but a benefit to the United States in terms of natural resources as well as just expansion of land. We also were able to take the Midway Islands that were portrayed on the map before in 1867 very simply by the fact that we had a naval vessel go by an island. We kind of parked the naval vessel there, and the captain kind of got out and looked around. There was nobody on the island. The island was really small. It was like 2.4 square miles in total, and he kind of basically said, well, I guess this is U.S. territory, and he planted the U.S. flag, and the U.S. since 1867 had Midway. And Midway is going to play a big part in World War II, but that's kind of for later discussion. Where the United States really jumps headfirst into the waters of empire is with Hawaii. And as you can see from the map that is portrayed on the slide here, Hawaii is ideal for a number of reasons. A major trade route that can touch all the continents that are that border the Pacific Ocean. Also, there is a shallow harbor where you can basically house a naval base. There's Pearl Harbor. And Hawaii becomes a U.S. colony and then eventually a state in somewhat kind of an odd way. We did do business with Hawaii in the 1870s and 1880s, where a significant amount of Hawaiian sugar was imported into the United States. And we had a number of American farmers go to Hawaii, buy land from the Hawaiian government, and then basically farm there. And if any of you have ever eaten a Dole pineapple, well, you've basically taken a bite out of the company that made Hawaii a state, because Samuel Dole, along with the other major planters on the island in the 1890s, staged a revolution and basically ousted the Hawaiian monarchy and presented Hawaii to the United States kind of on a silver platter. And the president at the time, William McKinley, said, whoa, whoa, we didn't ask you guys to do this. But after kind of looking at the strategic value of Hawaii, we eventually said, yeah, this is probably a good idea. So Hawaii became a U.S. territory in 1898, and it became a state in 1959. We also had holdings in Samoa in 1899, but really what we're going to be discussing here momentarily is the role of Cuba, because Cuba really is the kind of tipping point in terms of the United States expanding its empire of islands. And we're going to be discussing that momentarily. So if you could, please go ahead and make sure you get all of this down. I'll pause for 10 seconds before I progress to the next part of the class, and we'll go from there. And I do realize this is somewhat weird. I'm obviously at the district office doing my Common Core thing, and here I am talking to you guys. So I hope that you found this beneficial. It's not, obviously the best way of introducing a subject, but I hope that you found it, at the very least, helpful. And certainly, if you have any questions about any of the content that we covered in this particular section, don't hesitate to ask me when I see you on Wednesday. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for 10 seconds, although I'm probably not going to need to, and then we will progress to the next part of class. Okay, so we're going to progress to the next part of the lesson here. What you see in front of you right now are two newspaper article titles. These are of course, fictitious, and I'm not going to show you like what's in the article per se. But I want you to base your next response just on the titles alone. So, underneath your last slide of Cornell notes that you just finished taking, I'd like you on the left-hand side of your Cornell notes to write the initials PR, because you're going to take about 5 minutes to personally respond quietly to the following questions about these two titles. So, the two titles, one says "Search for Missing Bride Continues," and the second title says "Bride Missing!" Exclamation point. Groom's family blame history of mental illness. So I'd like you to answer these questions, just from your own perspective, about these two titles. Question number one in your PR: How do these headlines differ, and in what way? Number two: Consider the wording of these titles and how a prospective reader might respond to each article. And lastly, of the two titles, which do you think is the most reliable and why? So that's your task for the next 5 minutes. And I'm going to pause here for about 10 seconds to give our substitute teacher time to pause the video. And then we'll progress to the next part of the lesson. So please, if you could, write your PR on your Cornell notes now. Okay, so this may seem a bit odd to be in the middle of kind of our talk about American imperialism, but the media plays a very important role into the next step the United States is about to take. Now, if we look at these two titles, a couple things stand out. The headlines differ in the fact that headline one is very open ended. It doesn't associate blame. It's very kind of like, hey, we're still looking for this missing bride. Whereas headline two automatically tells the prospective reader not only is this bride missing, but it's likely because she's crazy. We also see that the second headline is certainly biased because the groom's family is the one that is blaming her history of mental illness. We don't know if that's necessarily the case. Now, in terms of which is the more reliable, depending on what your response was, there's validity on either side. But I think just looking at the titles the way they are, we'd have to assume that the first one is the most reliable because it doesn't make any assumptions. It allows the reader simply to say, hey, we've got this bride and she's missing, and you should probably read this article. Whereas the second one is a little more sensationalized. And that's going to really kind of be the lead in to our next discussion here. And it's about Cuba. So you don't have to take any notes for this part, but I would like you to listen. So the United States has a neighbor right off the coast of Florida, 90 miles away, which is the colony then of Cuba in the 1890s. It is a colony of Spain. It's one of the few remaining colonial holdings that Spain has in the Western Hemisphere. And from 1895 to 1897, Cuba is embroiled in a war against Spain. Now, the reasons why these Cubans are fighting for their independence may sound familiar. Their taxes are too high, they have no representation in the Spanish government, and they feel that they should. So this would obviously kind of remind you of the circumstances of the American colonists leading up to the American Revolution. And there's also another couple parallels to draw here. The Cubans had their Washington-esque figure in Jose Marti, and the war was fought against a very large military. Spain was a well-developed country. Cuba was basically kind of a ragtag group of rebels using guerrilla warfare tactics, very much like the American colonists. And the war itself was extremely brutal. The Spanish had to resort to scorched earth kind of practices that were common in the Napoleonic Wars, where you would basically take all the inhabitants of a town or village, remove the people from said town or village, and then basically burn everything, burn the crops, burn the village itself, and then anyone that was suspected of being a rebel or a rebel sympathizer was put in a concentration camps. Now I know that when I say the word concentration camp, that obviously registers in our brain. We automatically think of what happened in World War II in Nazi Germany. Now, I want to just make sure that I clarify, though, that these concentration camps were simply, I guess you could say, jails. No one was necessarily tortured in them, at least that we know. But we know the conditions were not exactly that great because since the Spanish didn't know who they were fighting, they just assumed anyone who was Cuban was a potential enemy. Now, all of this obviously is being reported back to the United States in the media. And you can imagine how many Americans felt when they saw the circumstances, the reasons why Cuba was fighting for its independence. And there's a lot of sentimentality there where you'd say, oh my God, this is where we were in 1776, and look at this little nation. They're trying to get their independence, too. So we should help them. So that sentimentality plays into the reaction of the U.S. government towards the situation in Cuba. Let's not forget, too, it's only 90 miles off of our coast. So that's something that we have to deal with. But there's some other interest at play here as well. And these interests are primarily economic. We have a number of investments in Cuba, primarily in sugar. The robber barons or captains of industry like Rockefeller and Morgan, depending on how you want to view them, they owned a lot of stock in Cuban-based companies. And since we know these guys had plenty of cash, we can assume they had plenty of political influence. And so, because of the kind of sentimental, ties to the American Revolution, the suffering, that the Cuban people surely endured at the hands of the Spanish, and the economic ties, the U.S. government is forced to take action. So, what do? Well, the U.S. government sends one battleship, the USS Maine, to Cuba. Now, you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, if we're going to actually do something about this, maybe we should send, maybe the Atlantic Fleet. But we actually told Spain we were coming. We said, hey, listen, we know you guys have a bit of a, kind of war going on here in Cuba, but we do have American citizens that are there, and we have some American businesses and, just in general American interest there. And we'd like to send one of our battleships to kind of protect not only our interests, but our citizens. How would you feel about that? And the Spanish agreed. They said, yeah, that's no problem. You're just sending one? Yeah, no problem. Send it on down. So the USS Maine, which you see pictured there, a very powerful battleship in its own right, is docked in Havana Harbor. And let's remember, harbors are nothing more than parking spaces for boats. And the Maine parks in the middle of the Spanish fleet because obviously they're fighting a war in Cuba, so the fleet's parked there. And the USS Maine is kind of kind of like Sesame Street says, like one of these things is not like the other. It's just kind of there. And so they park and they think, okay, well, we're going to be here and we're going to make sure any American citizens can be protected in case things go south. Well, as soon as the Maine docks in Havana Harbor, that night, a little before 10 o'clock, the following happens. The ship explodes. It rises 10 feet out of the water because of the violence of the explosion. Apparently, you could hear it all over Cuba. And when the dust settled after the explosion, and here's a picture of the aftermath the next morning, the Maine was utterly destroyed. And we can assume that a number of American sailors were killed in the process. Now, at this point, nobody knows why it blew up, what were the circumstances that led to it. And remember, because the Cuban Revolution is news, there's a number of American reporters, for the major American media outlets at the beginning of the 20th century. They're down there covering it because it makes good news. And so the first telegram that's sent back to the United States within about a half hour of the Maine's explosion says the following, and I'd like you to read it along with me. So here is the telegram. It says, 9:40 p.m., a massive explosion shook the USS Maine. The blast occurred within the forward section of the ship. Preliminary reports conclude between 254 to 266 Americans dead. Numerous others injured. No report on what caused the explosion. Ship is completely destroyed. Investigation is underway. So now this is essentially the first story that came out of Cuba after the main, tragically exploded. So this is the step I'd like you guys to take now in your table groups. I'd like you please to take out document A from the New York Journal. And what you're going to be doing is I'd like you right now in your groups, and I'm going to give you like a 10-second wait period to number yourselves off within your groups of three, 1 through 3. So please go ahead and do that now. Okay, at this point, you have numbered yourself in your groups of 3, the number 1, 2, or 3. So if you are either a number 1 or a number 3, what I would like you to do in the next 7 minutes is I would like you to read, capt, and annotate document A. Now, if you're a number 2, please turn that handout over on the backside, and you are going to do the same. You're going to read and capt and annotate document B. Now, this process should take you about 7 minutes or so. And once this process is done and everyone's ready, I'm going to go ahead and ask our substitute teacher to go ahead and continue the video. So I'm going to pause here for about 10 seconds. And if you could please read and capt the document that you and your group have chosen. Okay, so now you, at your table groups, have read and capped both document A from the New York Journal and document B from the New York Times. Now, these were both newspaper articles that were written about the explosion of the USS Maine. Now, what I'd like you guys to do for the next 2 to 3 minutes at your table groups is I would like you to discuss whether document A or document B relates to this telegram and in what way. So essentially, which of the 2 documents is the best kind of representation of the content of this telegram? Take 2 to 3 minutes to discuss that, and then once again, I'll pause 10 seconds before we go to the next part of the lesson. Okay, so now you have discussed at your groups which document kind of best lends itself to this particular telegram. And I would imagine that you found similarities in both, but really, document B, which is the New York Times article, best kind of represents, the content of this telegram. Document A is very sensationalized. It places blame against, specifically, lays it at the door of Spain. The telegram says nothing about that. And just the overall tone of document B is very calm, very cool, saying, hey, we don't know what happened. We think it might be an accident. Whereas document A, the New York Journal, is very kind of, it blames, it says, it's Spain's fault. It's some hidden enemy that did this to us. We're going to give a $50,000 reward to anybody that gives us information as to who's behind this. We're gonna find him. So what you guys just read is an example of, in one case, in document B, an example of excellent reporting. Somebody who is simply reporting events as they see them. They're talking to experts and making the viewer kind of make their own judgment. Whereas document A is an example of the following. It is an example of a newspaper circulation war that is taking place in New York between William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. And this type of sensationalized news that you see kind of exhibited here in document A is called yellow journalism. And it's where, common everyday news is taken and basically polished to where it's very entertaining. And let's face it, I mean, I would imagine that if you were to put 2 headlines up, like the ones that we talked about earlier, about the missing bride, most people would likely be drawn to the second headline because it just seems more interesting. It seems like it could be somewhat juicy. We live in a rubberneck society. I mean, when people drive down the freeway and they see somebody who's on the side of the freeway changing a tire, what do? We turn and look, oh, you're changing a tire. Um, so these media moguls are playing off of that. And yellow journalism plays a huge part in the United States becoming an empire. And you may think, well, wait a minute, we're talking about newspapers here. How could a newspaper report have any influence on whether or not the United States becomes an empire? Well, it's a quote from one of these individuals that you see pictured here, where when asked about kind of, hey, are you reporting the news or are you reporting like a version of the news? And one of these individuals said, "Listen, you furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." Essentially saying that we can make this happen through the media. Now, you may think, why is yellow journalism important here? Well, because of the sensationalized news stories, like you saw in Document A, there was a lot of pressure brought to bear against the U.S. government to do something. And so, what the United States government did within 3 months of the Maine exploding is we declared war on Spain. And we fought a war with Spain that it was essentially caused by the media and yellow journalism. The war itself lasted 3 months. Teddy Roosevelt called it a splendid little war. There were actually more American casualties due to food poisoning because the food that the U.S. government had kind of given the soldiers in Cuba and also in the Philippines, the other theater of the war, was tainted and rotten. So more people died of food poisoning than they did in battle. But at the end result of it all, after 3 months of warfare, the United States got essentially a sphere of influence in Cuba, where they were independent, but we basically said, yeah, we're going to interfere with your business whenever we feel like it. And then we gained actual colonies in the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. And again, this is all because of yellow journalism. And you might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, what? That seems like an odd term. Like, why would you call it yellow journalism? Well, because both Pulitzer and Hearst, pictured in this cartoon here, were trying to sell newspapers. And how do you sell newspapers? Well, not only do you get good writers that create these kind of, romanticized stories, but you also get other things that the public wants. And one of the things that the public wanted in the 1890s was the comic strip, The Yellow Kid, which is pictured here. And as you can see, it's a creepy looking baby cowboy. I don't get it. Apparently, it was a big thing in the 1890s. But the name yellow journalism originates from a very popular comic strip that was portrayed both in Hearst and Pulitzer's newspapers. And again, why was yellow journalism a thing? Because of circulation, because of money. So here we have another example of why America became an empire. Obviously, for economic reasons, in terms of expanding the American economy and competition with the rest of the world, but also the American media basically forced the United States, at least in the case of the Spanish-American War, to become an empire. So what we're going to do now is we're going to transition to the piece on the DBQ. And what I'd like you guys to do, please, is keep out your Cornell notes and please keep out all your documents because you're going to be using those. But at this moment in time, what I'd like you to do is take out the document that is titled DBQ Outline. Okay, so now that you've taken out that document, I want to kind of walk you through it. Very much like last semester where I gave you the outline for how I am recommending the long essay be tackled, what you have in front of you is how the DBQ should be tackled, same format. And just to note, you guys are going to be able to use this outline not only for the DBQ that you write on Friday, but the next 2 DBQs after that. And remember, I think you all are great writers. These suggestions on how to set up the writing as well as the sentence stems that we're really going to focus on here are simply to kind of give you kind of a baseline. And then you, individually as a writer, can choose to either, stick with that baseline, that'll still get you the points, or if you feel like, well, okay, I kind of have an idea of what I'm supposed to talk about or how I'm supposed to frame this, and you can kind of go your own way. But again, these are my recommendations, and we will briefly go over them on Wednesday when I see everybody. So let's take a look at the outlining the essay document. So there are obviously some additions to the long essay outline. And anything you look at on that document that is shaded in gray is exactly the same as it was last semester with the long essay. Okay, so that means anything in white is a new addition or something new that we haven't really practiced over the last, 4.5, 5 months. So what are the new additions to our outline? If all the grayed area is the same as the long essay, what in the DBQ are we going to have to do that's new? Well, most of the new stuff we're going to have to do in the DBQ is is in the supporting paragraph. And remember, you don't have to copy any of this down. I put this in the subplan, at least I'm pretty sure I did. And but please, this is all just me explaining this kind of to you where you guys can practice it. So the new additions, as I said, are primarily in two places. They're in the supporting paragraph primarily, and they're in the conclusion. And in the supporting paragraph, we still have obviously our topic sentence, but what we also have to add is our cap sentence for each document. We also, in the supporting paragraph, have to be very explicit in terms of after we capped a particular document and write a cap sentence or sentences, we have to provide a citation for what document we got it from, and we'll talk about that momentarily. We also have to provide a warrant for each document. Now, we have, in the past, through the long essay, had to provide a warrant where we say, okay, well, here's our historical evidence, and our warrant is here's how it links to the thesis. But the difference in the DBQ is that our warrant has to explain how the content of the document links back to our thesis, which is somewhat new for us. The other new piece to the supporting paragraph is the argument development point. This is where we group the documents together and explain how they are related to each other in one way or another. And we're going to practice that here in a second. And lastly, the other big change is that you have to provide evidence beyond the document. Now, this is going to take place in your conclusion, which we are going to go over Wednesday. Our focus today is mainly going to be on the supporting paragraph. So when I come back and see you guys on Wednesday, we will spend more time on the evidence beyond the document section. Okay, so when you write your supporting paragraph for a DBQ, we're going to talk here in a second about how to group the documents. But basically, you need the same thing. You need a topic sentence. You need a cap sentence or sentences. And please notice that I didn't put the T here because it is not specifically referenced on the AP rubric for the DBQ. Obviously, if you want to identify the theme in American history that fits that particular document, I'd say go ahead. But what they are looking for is for you to identify throughout your DBQ context, audience, purpose, and point of view of each document. So you have your topic sentence, you have your cap sentence, you then have to make sure that you cite your cap sentences. Now, you can cite the documents in one of two ways. You can do it in the actual sentence where you would write, as seen in document 1, blah, 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 blah. Or the other option is you can use a parenthetical citation where you write your cap sentence where you identify context, audience, purpose, and point of view. And then at the end of that sentence or sentences, in parentheses, you simply put Doc 1. Now, remember, there's 7 documents for the U.S. History DBQ, and they will be numbered. They're not going to be lettered, so it will be Doc 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now, I want to make sure that I spend some time on this because it is extremely important for you to cite your documents. And it might seem a little asinine to think, well, don't they know what we're talking about? But I really want to make sure you guys are deliberate in this area because I was talking to one of my AP mentors who's been teaching AP since the 1970s. And he is a table leader in Kentucky at the grading that takes place. I'm actually going there this summer for the first time. Yay me. And I was talking to Keith and I said, hey man, you just graded the new version of the AP test, which, this year's seniors took last year. And I said, what are the big takeaways? What are the things that I can kind of tell my students? And of course, the first thing he said is like, well, they need to know American history. They need to know their factual evidence. They need to show they know the content. And I was like, yeah, man, I really, kind of focus on that particular point a lot in to my students and in my classes. But like, what's the other key? And he's like, well, honestly, it's kind of a weird one. And I was like, really? It's like, yeah. He said, as a table leader, I get to hear the comments from all the other teachers that are grading these, hundreds, if not thousands of essays. And the one comment that they had with the DBQ is that they became frustrated when the students didn't cite their DBQ. And I was like, well, did that affect their grade? And he said, well, I don't know. He said, what AP readers want to do is they want to get through the essay efficiently, accurately, but also quickly because they have a lot of essays to read. And he said that numbering the documents or citing them in the actual essay helps make life easier for the AP reader. So Keith's big kind of, you know, aha to me was very simple. He said, if your students cite their documents, they are essentially guaranteeing that their AP reader is going to be somewhat more lenient. Whereas if they don't cite their documents, it forces the reader to look at their essay kind of under a microscope, a microscope, to where they have to find where the documents are. So that's the last thing that you guys want to do is have an AP reader, spend more time on your essay because they're always going to find flaws that way. Because this is a rough draft that you guys are writing. So please, for goodness sake, make sure that you cite your documents, and you'll get some practice with that on Friday. So after you have your topic sentence and you write your cap sentence and you cite it, then it's your warrant where you're explaining how the content of the document proves your thesis. Now, that's the format that you're going to follow for every document in the DBQ. But that begs the question, okay, well, how do I group the documents? Well, you group the documents quite simply in the following format. Now, it's just a recommendation. Obviously, if you see some relationships between the documents that maybe make sense in terms of their grouping, if you'd like to do it chronologically, if that makes more sense to you, that's fine. But kind of the fallback or kind of the automatic that I want you guys to follow is listed here. And that is you want to group your supporting paragraphs, because remember, this is still a 5-paragraph essay. And you want to group your documents as follows. Your first supporting paragraph after your introduction should contain your strongest documents. Now, these are the documents that you can speak with some knowledge on, not only that, some accurate knowledge, but you can also very clearly identify the context, audience, purpose, and point of view for both documents. You want to start from a position of strength. Your second supporting paragraph, that's where you should have your kind of middling documents. These are the ones where I feel okay about them. I don't feel great like the first paragraph, but I feel okay. So your first and second supporting paragraph should highlight 2 documents each. And then your third supporting paragraph should basically be everything else. Now, please notice that I am asking you to include all documents and analyze all documents in your essay, even though the rubric only calls for 6. Now, the rationale behind that is pretty simple. It just increases your chances of getting the point. Now, after you group the documents and you write your topic sentence and you write your cap sentence and you cite it and you explain it with your warrant, okay, this is how this particular document proves my thesis. Once you do that for both documents, say in a supporting paragraph, you have one more step. And that is you have to get the argument development point, where you identify how the documents are related to one another. Now, you have some options here. You don't have to do all 3 of them. You only have to do 1 per set of documents. You can either show how the documents are opposite, how they contradict each other, or you can show how they are related to one another, how what they agree on. And the reason these 2 are underlined is because these are the 2 that you're going to focus on in the activity today. And lastly, we're going to talk about on Wednesday what it means to qualify a document. So stay tuned for that. So our focus really today is going to be on 2 things. We're going to take another crack at practicing the cap sentences. And this time you're going to have your outlines to help you. And then we're going to talk about, really identifying how these documents relate to each other to get that argument development point. So I'm just going to pause here for a second to give people a chance to kind of catch up. And then after you guys are ready, just go ahead and click start again and we'll begin. Okay, so you're going to see a slide here that really is going to focus on what we're going to be discussing on Wednesday, and that is the conclusion. We already know how to write a conclusion. You got your historical synthesis, your explanation of historical synthesis, and lastly, your rephrasing of the thesis. Well, we're going to focus on the evidence beyond the document. Now remember, you provide evidence obviously in your 7 documents because you talk about the context of each document. And then in your introduction, you talk about the context of the era. Now, in order to get this evidence beyond the document point, you have to basically pick a piece of evidence that either A, wasn't referenced by the documents, or B, was not included in your introduction. But we're going to talk about that more on Wednesday. And then, of course, here are the other pieces of the conclusion, which are, basically the same from the long essay. So this is the task that I'd like you guys to perform here in the next 5 or 10 minutes. So you've already, at your table, you've read and capped document A and document B. Some of you read the New York Journal and its report on the USS Maine. Some of you read document B, the New York Times report on the USS Maine. So the first thing I'd like you guys to do at your table groups is take about 5 to 7 minutes. And I'd like you to write, and you can pick which document you'd like to write it for, whether it's document A or document B. I'd like you to write a cap sentence for the document that you pick. But here's the key. The last class that we had with each other last week, I asked all of you to practice writing a cap sentence on your own. It's difficult. What I'd like you guys to do for this activity is I'd like you to use the sentence stems that are in the supporting paragraph section for capping the document on your Outlining the DBQ handout. So again, you can pick one document, either A or B, and using the sentence stems, I would like you to take the next 5 to, we'll say 7, 8 minutes to, on your Cornell notes, write down as a group a cap sentence using the sentence stems. I'm going to go ahead and pause here for 10 seconds, and when you guys are ready to proceed to the last part of the lesson, please go ahead and press play. Okay, now that you've written your cap sentence for whatever document, the one thing that I want to just call to your attention is I'm assuming that most of you had an easier time writing the cap sentence with the sentence stems to kind of get you started for context, audience, purpose, and point of view than you did without the stems when you did it cold. Now we're going to practice this a lot, and the sentence stems, remember guys, they are simply kind of a baseline. One of the things that really helped me as a student is I loved it when my teachers would give me an example that I could build off. Now, for some of you, you may use these sentence stems throughout the essay, and that's fine. There's really no problem with that. But for most of you, especially those of you who consider yourself a pretty decent writer, use the sentence stems as like a starting point. And what I would do if I were given a sentence stem is I say, okay, I kind of know how to word that a different way to kind of give my reader some variety. So that's what those are for. And we are, as I said, going to be practicing these more throughout the next couple months leading up to the AP exam. This is the final step that I'd like you guys to take for class. And I don't know if the timing worked out. Hopefully it did. Because I've never really done this before. So it's kind of a new thing. I'd like you to do the following. At your table groups, right below where you wrote your cap sentence for whichever document, I'd like you to compare documents A and B, and using the sentence stems on the argument development point, which is on the back side of your Outlining the DBQ handout at the top, I'd like you to do the following. I'd like you to, below your cap sentence on your Cornell notes, I'd like you to write, using the sentence stems for argument development, how documents A and B contradict each other, and secondly, how documents A and B agree or corroborate with each other. All right, and again, you're going to put this in your Cornell notes. This should take you about 5 to 7 minutes to do. And then once you guys are done, I'm going to kind of identify what are some of the similarities and differences between these two documents. And that should call us good for the day. So take 5 to 7 minutes, and when you're ready to progress to the last portion of the lesson, please, please go ahead and unpause this. Okay, so that kind of concludes the lesson for today, but I wanted to point out a couple things. In terms of argument development, you only need to do one of the three actions. Either you need to, at the end of your supporting paragraph, talk about how the documents contradict one another, how they complement one another, or using a qualifying statement to say, well, the document's correct in this way, but it's incorrect in this way. And we're going to work on that on Wednesday. So undoubtedly, you have determined that documents A and B are there's a great deal of contradiction between the two. A document A places blame against Spain, says it was done on purpose. Document B says it was an accident. Right? Document A is written in a much more kind of sensationalized style, whereas document B is very straightforward and very kind of bland. Document A offers a reward for $50,000. Not exactly sure how realistic that is. Document B does not. So there are clearly more differences than similarities between these documents. The similarities, there are some. Both documents were created on the same day. Both of them were created by New York-based papers. And both of them mention the importance of the magazine, the powder magazine, where all the gunpowder is held in a battleship of that era, as being part of the problem with the explosion. Document A suggests something from the outside of the ship caused it to ignite. Document B suggests, well, it was an accident somehow internally inside the ship. And just to kind of wrap things up, the USS Maine, it was discovered, or determined, I should say, in the 1960s that it was indeed an accident. In other words, there was an engineering fault where the insulation between the gunpowder magazine and one of the motors for the engine of the ship was not insulated properly, which meant the wall got really hot. And after, being at sea, that heat basically ignited the gunpowder, thus causing the Maine to explode. So that kind of concludes our lesson for the day. Thank you for following along with this. This is, again, it's kind of a new thing for me. Here I am sitting, it's like 11 o'clock at night. Hopefully that all made sense. I'm a little tired right now. Yeah, I'd love to hear your feedback on how this went when I see you guys on Wednesday. If there is time left in the period, what I would suggest that you use it for is completing your Chapter 21 notes that are due on Friday. And just a bit of advice, those Chapter 21 notes are going to be vital to writing your Group DBQ on Friday. So well done, guys, and thanks for being nice to our substitute teacher. And I will see you all on Wednesday. All right, bye-bye, and may the force be with you all.